Commander Kang Daeho stared at the radar screen in disbelief. The dots appearing on his display were bigger than anything he had ever seen. Each alien ship was the size of a small city. There were over 200 of them floating in space like metal mountains. "Sir, they just appeared out of nowhere," said Lieutenant Park So-min, her voice shaking. "Our sensors didn't detect anything until they were already here." Kang stood on the bridge of the human frigate Soul's Pride. It was one of only 6 human ships defending the colony of New Busan. These ships were built for mining protection, not war. Their weapons were designed to blast apart asteroids, not fight alien battleships. The colony below them held 3 million people. Farmers, miners, engineers, and their families. They had come here to build a new life among the stars. Now they might all die. "Open a channel to Earth," Kang ordered. "Priority Alpha. Tell them we have first contact with alien forces." The alien ships moved closer. Each one was beautiful in a terrifying way. Their hulls seemed to glow with soft blue light. Energy shields wrapped around them like glowing curtains. These ships had traveled between stars. They had technology that humans could only dream of. A transmission came through the communication system. The alien voice spoke perfect Korean. "I am Admiral Vextar of the Vorlak Dominion. We have studied your species. You show promise, but you are still children playing with dangerous toys. Submit to our guidance and we will teach you to be better. Fight us and we will teach you through force." The transmission ended. Kang felt cold sweat on his forehead. The aliens had been watching humanity. They knew human languages. They had been planning this. On Earth, President Park Hae-jin sat in the emergency meeting room deep under Seoul. The world's leaders filled the screens around her. Military officers, scientists, and politicians all looked worried. The alien message had reached Earth faster than light, carried by quantum communicators. "How long do we have?" asked General Kim Soo-bin, the head of Earth's military forces. 7 days, Park replied. "They want an answer in 7 days. Dr. Yoon Tae-sung, an expert in military psychology, leaned forward. "They're not here to destroy us. If they wanted us dead, we would already be dead. They want to rule us. They see us as children who need to be taught how to behave." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what this meant. The aliens thought humans were primitive. They believed they had the right to control human civilization. "What are our options?" Park asked. General Kim activated a holographic display. It showed human military strength compared to the alien fleet. The numbers were not good. "Our best weapons are railguns and nuclear missiles," Kim said. "Their shields can probably stop both. Their weapons can crack moons. We have 6 ships at New Busan. They have over 200. So we surrender?" asked Minister Lee Young-ho. "Maybe," Kim said. "But they've made one mistake. They assume we'll fight like them. They assume we follow the same rules they do." Deep beneath Seoul, in a bunker that didn't appear on any official map, Director Choi Min-woo watched the meeting through secure channels. Around him, computers hummed quietly. File cabinets lined the walls, marked with warning symbols. This was Project Nightmare, humanity's most secret research division. For 50 years, Project Nightmare had studied the darkest parts of human nature. Not weapons or technology, but the psychological tools that had helped humans survive ice ages, plagues, and centuries of war. They had cataloged every form of cruelty humans had ever invented. They had studied mass killers, war criminals, and dictators. They had learned what made humans different from other species. Choi picked up a secure phone and called President Park. "Madam President, this is Director Choi. I need to brief you on Project Nightmare." An hour later, Park sat in the secret bunker. Around her were displays showing human history, videos of ancient battles, photos of concentration camps, documents about torture techniques, studies of psychological warfare. "For decades, we've studied humanity's capacity for darkness," Choi explained. "Every species that reaches the stars probably goes through the same process. They learn to control their violent nature. They become civilized. They forget what they were. And humans?" Park asked. "We never forgot. We study our monsters. We remember our wars. We know exactly what we're capable of when pushed too far." Choi activated another display. It showed brain scans, psychological profiles, and military training programs. "The aliens brought battleships," he said. "Superior technology. Better weapons, stronger shields. But we have something they've probably never encountered. Something they may have eliminated from their own species thousands of years ago." "What?" Pure weaponized savagery, the ability to do whatever it takes to survive, the willingness to become monsters if that's what victory requires. Park stared at the displays. She saw images of human soldiers in combat. Their faces showed something that chilled her. Not fear or anger, but cold determination. The look of predators who had decided to hunt. You're talking about war crimes, torture. Things civilized people don't do. Civilized people don't survive when uncivilized people attack them. Choi replied, "The aliens want to educate us. They want to teach us to be like them. Peaceful, controlled, predictable." He paused and looked directly at her. "But maybe it's time we educated them instead. Maybe it's time they learned what happens when you threaten the one species in the galaxy that never stopped being apex predators." Park felt something cold settle in her stomach. She understood what Choi was suggesting. Humanity couldn't win with technology. They couldn't match alien firepower, but they could fight in ways the aliens had never imagined. Ways that civilized species had forgotten. "What do you need?" she asked. "Full authorization for Project Nightmare. Release of all ethical restrictions on military research. And volunteers." "What kind of volunteers?" "People who understand that sometimes good people have to do terrible things. People who can look into the abyss and not just fight monsters, but become them." Back at New Busan, Commander Kang received new orders from Earth. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. The military protocols had changed. The rules of engagement had been suspended. New equipment was being shipped to his fleet. As he read the orders, Kang felt his hands shake. He had served in the military for 20 years. He thought he understood war. But these orders described something different. Something darker. The aliens wanted to educate humanity. They would learn that humans had their own lessons to teach. Lessons written in blood and terror. Lessons that civilized species had tried to forget. The war was about to begin, but it wouldn't be the kind of war the aliens expected. The first alien attack came at dawn on New Jeju, a farming world where 2 million humans grew food for the outer colonies. Captain Lee Junho watched from his command bunker as the Vorlak ships descended from orbit like falling stars. The alien weapons were precise and clean. Energy beams struck military targets with surgical accuracy. The planetary defense grid went dark in minutes. Communications towers crumbled into dust. The spaceport became a field of twisted metal. But the aliens didn't target civilian areas. They avoided hospitals, schools, and residential districts. Their weapons caused minimal collateral damage. This was a civilized conquest, conducted according to rules that humans had never agreed to follow. "They fight like gentlemen," Lee muttered to his aide, Sergeant Nam Yunji. "They actually believe there are rules in war." The Vorlak ground forces landed in orderly formations. Their soldiers moved in perfect coordination, following protocols that had been refined over centuries. They wore powered armor that gleamed like mirrors. Their weapons hummed with contained energy. War Commander Thexmar led the occupation force. He had conquered 12 worlds for the Vorlak Dominion, always with minimal casualties. His troops were trained to pacify primitive species while preserving their civilian populations. Standard procedure called for the capture of military leaders, the establishment of education centers, and the gradual integration of the conquered species into Vorlak society. But the humans didn't follow standard patterns. The first sign of trouble came when a group of human soldiers approached a Vorlak checkpoint with white flags. They claimed to be surrendering. When the Vorlak lowered their weapons to accept the surrender, the humans detonated hidden explosives. The blast killed 8 Vorlak soldiers and wounded dozens more. Thexmar was confused. His species had eliminated such deceptive tactics from warfare millennia ago. False surrender was considered a war crime by every civilized species in the galaxy, yet these humans used it as readily as breathing. The second incident happened at a medical station. Vorlak medics were treating wounded humans and aliens alike, following their strict medical ethics. A human patient, apparently unconscious, suddenly attacked a medic with a hidden blade. The medic survived, but barely. "Commander," reported his aide, "the humans are not responding to our pacification protocols. They refuse to acknowledge our authority. They continue fighting even when clearly defeated." Thexmar studied reports from across the planet. Humans were using tactics no civilized species would employ. They hid weapons and medical supplies. They used children as message carriers, knowing Vorlak soldiers wouldn't harm them. They poisoned water supplies, forcing the aliens to rely on their own rations. Lieutenant Nam Yunji led a small resistance cell in the mountains outside New Seoul. Her unit had captured 5 Vorlak soldiers during a failed patrol. Instead of treating them as prisoners of war, she decided to conduct an experiment. The Vorlak were locked in a basement room equipped with video screens. Nam played recordings of human history for them. She started with recent conflicts, then worked backward through time: the siege of Sarajevo, the Khmer Rouge, the Holocaust, the rape of Nanking, the Mongol conquests, the Aztec sacrifices. Hours of footage showing humans at their absolute worst. The Vorlak prisoners watched in growing horror. Their species had evolved past such brutality. They had eliminated warfare, torture, and mass killing from their society so long ago that these concepts seemed like ancient myths. "This is your education," Nam told them through the intercom. "You want to teach us to be civilized? These are our teachers. This is what we learned from." One of the prisoners, a young soldier named Kexnor, began showing signs of psychological breakdown. He had never seen deliberate cruelty before. His mind couldn't process the systematic nature of human violence. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would anyone do these things?" "Because we could," Nam replied. "Because sometimes survival means becoming a monster. Because sometimes monsters win." On Earth, Dr. Shin Hyun-woo worked around the clock preparing psychological weapons. His team had studied alien communication intercepts, learning how Vorlak minds processed information. They were crafting transmissions designed to exploit weaknesses in alien psychology. The first broadcast was simple: a compilation of human horror films edited to remove obvious fictional elements. To alien minds unfamiliar with the concept of entertainment based on fear, these appeared to be historical documents. The movies showed humans enjoying violence. They depicted torture as art, murder as sport, terror as entertainment. The aliens who watched these transmissions couldn't understand how any species could create such content for pleasure. Admiral Vextar received reports of crew members experiencing what Vorlak medics called nightmare syndrome. Soldiers would suddenly stop functioning, paralyzed by fears they couldn't name. Some refused to leave their quarters. Others demanded reassignment away from human space. "Sir," his aide reported, 17 ships have requested permission to withdraw from the combat zone. The crews claimed they're experiencing psychological distress. Vextar was baffled. Vorlak warriors were trained to handle stress. They had faced dangerous alien creatures, hostile environments, and technical emergencies, but they had never faced an enemy that attacked their minds instead of their bodies. Meanwhile, Captain Bae Jinsu prepared for a special mission. His ship, the Incheon's Fury, had been modified to look damaged and helpless. The crew carried cultural artifacts that appeared harmless but were actually sophisticated psychological weapons. The plan was simple: allow the ship to be captured, then spread mimetic viruses through the Vorlak fleet. Ideas that would corrupt their moral certainty and introduce concepts their species had forgotten. The Vorlak took the bait. They captured Bae's ship and brought the crew aboard their flagship for interrogation. Following their ethical protocols, they treated the prisoners well. They provided medical care, adequate food, and comfortable quarters. But the humans had brought gifts. Books of human philosophy that questioned the nature of authority. Art that celebrated individual rebellion against collective order. Music that expressed emotions the Vorlak had eliminated from their society. Games that required deception and betrayal to win. The Vorlak studied these artifacts with scientific interest. They didn't realize they were exposing themselves to ideas that would spread like viruses through their collective consciousness. Young Vorlak crew members began asking questions their elders couldn't answer. Why should they follow orders without question? What gave their leaders the right to rule? Why was their way of life superior to others? Some began experimenting with emotions their species had suppressed. Anger, jealousy, the desire for personal power. These feelings were intoxicating to minds that had never experienced them. War Commander Thexmar received a disturbing report from his intelligence officers. Human prisoners were somehow influencing their guards. Vorlak soldiers were beginning to show sympathy for human cause. Some had even helped prisoners escape. How is this possible? Thexmar demanded. They use something called Stockholm Syndrome, his intelligence chief explained. They make their captors emotionally dependent on them. They exploit our natural empathy and turn it into a weapon. Thexmar felt something he had never experienced before. Doubt. Everything his species believed about warfare and civilization was being challenged. The humans weren't just resisting conquest. They were corrupting the very nature of Vorlac society. He sent a message to Admiral Vextar. The humans are not like other species we have encountered. They don't fight to win. They fight to make us lose ourselves. Request immediate reinforcements and authorization for enhanced interrogation techniques. But even as he sent the message, Thexamar wondered if it was already too late. The humans had planted seeds of corruption in Vorlac minds, ideas that couldn't be removed with weapons or technology. The education had begun, but the teachers weren't who anyone expected. Director Choi Min-woo stood before a row of cells deep beneath the mountains of Korea. Behind the reinforced glass were volunteers for the most classified program in human history. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were predators that humanity had created for one purpose: to fight wars that civilized people couldn't win. Authorization confirmed, came the voice through his earpiece. Project Nightmare is fully active. Major Han So-young walked down the corridor, studying files on each volunteer. Most were from death row, convicted of crimes so terrible that society had given up on them. Others came from psychiatric facilities, their minds already broken in specific ways. All had volunteered for experimental procedures that would remove their moral limitations. Subject 7 shows the most promise, reported Dr. Yoon Tae-sung. Complete lack of empathy but highly intelligent. Perfect for psychological operations. Subject 12 has extensive combat experience, added the psychiatrist. Multiple tours in the Colonial Marines before his breakdown. He knows how soldiers think, Han nodded. These weren't super soldiers in the traditional sense. They hadn't been enhanced physically. Instead, their minds had been altered to function without the conscience that limited normal humans. They were apex predators wearing human faces. Brief them on the mission, Han ordered. It's time to show the aliens what real monsters look like. In orbit around New Jeju, Admiral Vextar struggled with reports that made no sense. His crew members were experiencing mass psychological breakdown. Ship after ship reported the same symptoms: nightmares, paranoia, inability to function normally. The humans were broadcasting something they called entertainment on all frequencies. Vextar had ordered his communications officers to analyze the transmissions. What they found defied understanding. The humans had created stories about creatures that ate their own children. They had made games where the goal was to cause as much suffering as possible. They had written songs celebrating mass murder. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to enjoy these things. Admiral, his medical officer reported, crew members who have been exposed to human cultural transmissions are showing signs of moral degradation. Some are beginning to exhibit aggressive behavior toward their comrades. Vextar felt his species' equivalent of cold fear. The humans weren't just resisting conquest. They were actively corrupting Vorlac society, turning his own people into versions of themselves. On the surface of New Jeju, the first Pandora unit made contact with Vorlac forces. Major Han had chosen her team carefully, 5 humans who looked harmless but carried within them the capacity for unthinkable cruelty. They approached a Vorlac checkpoint carrying white flags, just as human soldiers had done before. But this time was different. When the aliens cautiously allowed them to approach, the humans didn't use explosives. Instead, they began to talk. "We want to surrender," said Corporal Park Min-ho, his voice calm and reasonable. "But first, we'd like to show you something about human culture." The Vorlac soldiers, following their protocols for prisoner processing, agreed to listen. Park began describing human history, but not the way Lieutenant Nam had done with her prisoners. This was different. This was seductive. He talked about the beauty of violence, the artistry of well-planned cruelty, the satisfaction of watching enemies suffer. He spoke about these concepts as if they were poetry, making them sound appealing rather than horrifying. The young Vorlac soldiers had never heard such ideas expressed with genuine enthusiasm. Their species had eliminated these concepts from their society, but they had never completely removed the capacity to understand them. "Wouldn't you like to feel that kind of power?" Park asked softly. "Wouldn't you like to know what it's like to make someone afraid of you?" One of the soldiers, Yilnara, found herself nodding before she realized what she was doing. The idea was seductive. For her entire life, she had followed orders, served the collective good, never considered her own desires. The human was offering her something forbidden and exciting. Dr. Shin Hyun-woo monitored the psychological assault from Earth. His team had spent months developing mimetic weapons designed specifically for the Vorlak mind, ideas that would spread through their collective consciousness like viruses, corrupting their moral certainty. The key was making corruption seem appealing rather than horrifying. Humans had learned to package evil in attractive wrapping. They had turned selfishness into individualism, cruelty into strength, chaos into freedom. These concepts were intoxicating to minds that had never experienced them. The Vorlak had spent millennia creating perfect order. Now humans were showing them the appeal of beautiful disorder. Agent Ryu Dongmin worked his way through the Vorlak fleet using captured access codes. His mission wasn't sabotage in the traditional sense. He wasn't destroying equipment or stealing information. Instead, he was introducing ideas. He left books in crew quarters. Philosophy that questioned authority. Stories that celebrated individual rebellion. Art that glorified violence and chaos. Each piece was carefully chosen to exploit specific weaknesses in Vorlak psychology. Young crew members began reading these materials in secret. They formed discussion groups that their officers didn't know about. They started questioning orders for the first time in their lives. "Why do we follow the old ways?" asked Sub-Commander Kilnor during one of these secret meetings. "What if the humans are right? What if we've been slaves to tradition instead of truly free?" These ideas spread through the fleet like a plague. Vorlak society had no immunity to concepts they had eliminated from their culture. They were experiencing philosophy the way unvaccinated humans might experience smallpox. Back on New Jeju, Dr. Park Ji-woon implemented the Stockholm Protocol with captured Vorlak prisoners. Unlike traditional interrogation, this process was designed to make the aliens emotionally dependent on their human captors. The captured Vorlak were treated well, but inconsistently. Sometimes they received excellent food and comfortable quarters. Other times they were deprived and isolated. The humans alternated between kindness and cruelty in carefully calculated patterns. The aliens began to crave their captors' approval. They started providing information not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to please the humans who controlled their world. Some began actively helping their captors, translating Vorlak communications and providing intelligence about their own people. They didn't see this as betrayal. They saw it as loyalty to the humans who had shown them a different way of thinking. War Commander Thexmar received reports that filled him with something his species called deep concern. His own soldiers were turning against each other. Some were refusing orders. Others were showing signs of what humans called individuality instead of collective purpose. Most disturbing, some were beginning to enjoy their work in ways that violated every principle of Vorlak society. They took pleasure in defeating human resistance. They began competing with each other for achievements. They started wanting personal recognition instead of collective success. "Sir," his aide reported, "we have 17 cases of soldiers requesting reassignment so they can prove themselves in combat. This behavior is unprecedented." Thexmar realized with growing horror that his troops were becoming infected with human psychology. They were learning to be selfish, competitive, and cruel. Everything the Vorlak had evolved past was returning like a genetic memory. He sent an emergency message to Admiral Vextar. "The humans haven't just resisted our education. They're educating us, and their lessons are poison to everything we are." But it was too late to stop the spread. Human ideas had taken root in Vorlak minds. The psychological warfare was working better than anyone had hoped. General Kim Subin reviewed reports from the battlefield with satisfaction. Humanity was losing every conventional engagement but winning the war that mattered. They were corrupting the aliens' ability to function as a unified force. "Authorize Operation Medusa," she ordered. "It's time to show them what happens when humans stop pretending to be civilized." The order went out to military bases across human space. Special prisoners were prepared for deployment. Humans who had been programmed to commit acts so terrible that they would traumatize their own captors. The real war was about to begin. The Vorlak Dominion was breaking apart from within. Fleet Admiral Korthovan watched from his flagship as ships that had served together for decades began treating each other as rivals, instead of allies. The unity that had made their species great was dissolving like salt in acid. "Sir," reported his communications officer, 3 more vessels have requested permission to operate independently. They claim they can be more effective without fleet coordination. Korthovan felt something his ancestors had called rage. The concept had been bred out of his species for over 1,000 years, but exposure to human psychology was awakening dormant emotions in Vorlak minds. The young officers were the worst affected. Sub-Commander Yilnara had openly questioned his orders during the last strategy meeting. She had suggested that maybe the humans were right about individual freedom being more important than collective duty. "The old ways are failing," she had said in front of the entire command staff. "Maybe it's time we learned from the humans instead of trying to destroy them." Such words would have been unthinkable just months ago. Now they were spreading through the fleet like a disease. Young Vorlak were reading human philosophy, listening to human music, adopting human ideas about personal achievement and individual worth. On the surface of New Jeju, Lieutenant Colonel Oh Minji prepared her most dangerous weapon yet. Operation Medusa involved human prisoners who had been psychologically programmed to commit acts that would shatter Vorlak moral frameworks. These weren't random acts of violence. Each action was carefully designed to exploit specific weaknesses in alien psychology. The Vorlak believed in the inherent goodness of intelligent life. They thought suffering was always meaningful, always serving some greater purpose. The humans were about to teach them otherwise. The first Medusa prisoner allowed himself to be captured during a staged resistance operation. Sergeant Jang Hae-sung walked into a Vorlak checkpoint with his hands raised, claiming to have information about human defenses. The Vorlak processed him according to their ethical guidelines. They provided medical care, adequate food, and humane treatment. They assigned him to a comfortable holding cell while preparing for interrogation. That night, Zhang began his real mission. He started by harming himself in ways that appeared accidental, but were actually calculated to traumatize his guards. He used broken glass to create wounds that wouldn't heal properly. He induced infections that caused visible suffering. He damaged himself slowly, methodically, while maintaining cheerful conversation with his captors. The Vorlak guards had never seen anything like it. In their society, self-harm was impossible to understand. Life was precious. Suffering was to be avoided or treated, never deliberately created. "Why are you doing this?" asked his primary guard, a young Vorlak named Texmore. "Because I can," Zhang replied with a smile. "Because making you watch makes me happy. Because your pain at seeing my pain gives my pain meaning." Texmore's mind couldn't process this logic. The human was creating a loop of suffering that served no purpose except to cause more suffering. It was pure cruelty distilled into its most basic form. Within days, Texmore was requesting reassignment. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. The human's cheerful self-destruction had broken something fundamental in his worldview. Agent Ryu Dongmin had successfully infiltrated the flagship of Admiral Vextar. His cover identity as a captured human collaborator gave him access to restricted areas of the ship. But his real mission wasn't espionage in the traditional sense. He was introducing concepts that the Vorlak had never experienced. Competition between individuals, the desire for personal recognition, the idea that some beings were naturally superior to others. He did this by suggesting simple changes to shipboard life. Why should all crew members receive equal recognition for their service? Wouldn't it be better to reward the most capable? Shouldn't individual achievement be celebrated? These ideas seemed reasonable to young Vorlak who had been exposed to human philosophy. They began competing with each other for the first time in their lives. They started keeping score of their accomplishments. They developed what humans called ego. The ship's efficiency actually improved at first. Competition drove innovation and effort. But it also created conflict where none had existed before. Crew members who had worked together harmoniously for years began seeing each other as obstacles to personal advancement. Dr. Park Ji-woon's Stockholm protocol was showing remarkable success with Vorlak prisoners. The captured aliens weren't just providing information anymore. They were actively working to undermine their own people's war effort. Commander Kexval had been captured 6 weeks ago. Now he was helping humans plan attacks on Vorlak positions. He translated enemy communications, revealed tactical weaknesses, and provided detailed information about Vorlak psychology. "They don't understand what you're doing to them," he told Park during one of their sessions. "They still think this is a conventional war. They don't realize you're changing what they are." Park nodded. The Stockholm Protocol wasn't just about making prisoners cooperative. It was about making them understand human perspective. Once they did, many chose humanity over their own species. Why did you change sides? Park asked. Because you showed me something my people forgot, Kexaval replied. You showed me that I could choose, that I didn't have to be what others expected me to be. For the first time in my life, I could be myself. This was the key to human psychological warfare. They weren't just destroying alien morale, they were offering alternatives to alien society that many found irresistibly appealing. On Earth, President Park Hae-jin reviewed reports that would have horrified her just months ago. Human forces were committing acts that violated every principle of civilized warfare, but these acts were winning the war in ways that conventional weapons never could. The aliens are requesting negotiation, reported General Kim Soo-bin. Their fleet commanders are reporting mass psychological casualties. Some ships are refusing to follow orders. What are they offering? Park asked. Complete withdrawal from human space. They want us to stop the psychological operations. They say we're destroying their civilization. Park felt no satisfaction in the victory. Humanity was winning by becoming monsters. They were proving that civilization was just a thin layer over something much darker. Continue the operations, she ordered. We can't stop now. If we show mercy, they'll recover and come back stronger. Meanwhile, the Vorlak fleet was fracturing into 3 distinct factions. The Purists, led by Fleet Admiral Korthvan, wanted to destroy humanity completely before the psychological contamination could spread further. The Corrupted, influenced by human ideas, believed their own society needed fundamental changes. They wanted to adopt human concepts of individual freedom and personal achievement. The Desperate, led by Admiral Vexitar, simply wanted to escape. They recognized that humanity represented a threat to everything the Vorlak had built over millennia of evolution. War Commander Thexamar found himself caught between these factions. His own troops were showing signs of all 3 influences. Some wanted to genocide humanity. Others wanted to join them. Still others wanted to flee and never return. Sir, his aide reported, we've lost contact with 7 outposts. The garrisons aren't responding to communications. Thexamar suspected he knew what had happened. Human psychological warfare had probably turned the outpost crews against each other, or convinced them to abandon their posts entirely. The humans had done something no enemy had ever accomplished. They had made the Vorlak afraid of themselves. Every day more aliens discovered they were capable of thoughts and actions their species had eliminated from their nature. Young Vorlak were experimenting with violence, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They were developing individual personalities instead of collective identity. They were questioning authority, demanding explanations, refusing orders. Everything that made the Vorlak strong as a species was being systematically destroyed. And the worst part was that many of them were choosing this destruction because it felt like freedom. Sub-Commander Yelnara stood on the bridge of her ship, looking at stars she had never really seen before. For her entire life, she had been part of something larger than herself. Now, for the first time, she was thinking about what she wanted as an individual. The humans had taught her that she could be selfish, that she could put her own desires ahead of collective good, that she could make choices based on personal preference rather than social duty. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Helm, she ordered, set course for human space. We're going to negotiate independently. Her crew looked at her in shock. Such an action violated every principle of Vorlak military doctrine. But several of them found themselves nodding in agreement. They wanted to choose their own path too. The corruption was complete. The Vorlak were becoming human, whether they wanted to or not. The final battle began not with weapons but with words. Admiral Vexitar led what remained of the unified Vorlak fleet toward Earth, while Fleet Admiral Korthvan's Purist faction followed close behind. Both groups had different goals, but the same desperate hope. Somehow stop the psychological plague before it destroyed their entire civilization. Commander Kang Dae-ho stood on the bridge of his new flagship, watching the alien approach. His ship was no longer purely human. Captured Vorlak technology had been integrated with human systems, crewed by both species working together. The hybrid vessel was a symbol of what the war had become. Sir, reported Lieutenant Park So-min, we're receiving surrender signals from 17 Vorlak ships. They're requesting asylum. These were vessels from the corrupted faction, Aliens who had been so influenced by human psychology that they could no longer function within their own society. They wanted to join humanity rather than fight it. Accept their surrender, Kang ordered. Route them to the integration facilities. The integration facilities were another dark innovation. Humans had learned to process alien defectors, using psychological techniques to complete their transformation from Vorlak citizens into human allies. The process was voluntary, but the volunteers rarely understood what they were volunteering for. President Park. Hyjin broadcast a message across all frequencies as the alien fleet approached Earth. Her words were carefully chosen to maximize psychological impact. You came to educate us about civilization, she said, her voice calm and reasonable. You thought civilization meant the absence of monsters, but you were wrong. Civilization is what happens when monsters choose to build instead of destroy. She paused, letting the words sink into alien minds that were already fragmented by months of psychological warfare. You forgot that your monsters existed. We never let ourselves forget ours. We study them. We learn from them. We become them when survival requires it. That's not a weakness. That's why we're still alive as a species. The message was transmitted with subliminal psychological triggers embedded in the audio, frequencies that induced fear in Vorlak brains, visual patterns that caused discomfort and anxiety. The aliens couldn't consciously detect these elements, but their minds responded anyway. Admiral Vextar felt the weight of failure crushing down on him. His fleet was dissolving around him. Ships were surrendering or simply fleeing. Crew members were requesting transfers to human vessels. His own officers were questioning orders that would have been followed without hesitation just a year ago. Sir, his communications officer reported, Admiral Korthvin is demanding that we coordinate our attack. He wants to destroy the human homeworld before the contamination spreads further. Vextar knew that Korthvin was probably right. Humanity represented an existential threat to Vorlak civilization. They had to be destroyed completely, or their psychological weapons would continue corrupting every species they encountered. But Vextar also knew it was already too late. The damage was done. Even if they destroyed Earth, the ideas had already spread. Young Vorlak throughout the Dominion were questioning traditional values, demanding individual rights, experimenting with forbidden emotions. The war had been lost the moment humans decided to fight it. Sergeant O Minji prepared for her final mission. Operation Medusa had been successful beyond all expectations, but there was one last psychological assault to deliver. She was going to broadcast the complete history of human warfare to every Vorlak ship simultaneously. Not just the major conflicts, but the small ones, the personal cruelties, the casual violence, the everyday horrors that humans inflicted on each other without even thinking about it. The goal was to overload alien minds with evidence of human savagery. Are you sure about this? Asked Dr. Shin Hyun-woo. This could cause permanent psychological damage to their entire species. That's the point, O replied. We want them to understand exactly what they're dealing with. We want them to know that this is what humans are when we stop pretending to be nice. The transmission began. Thousands of hours of human history compressed into a devastating psychological assault. Every torture technique humans had ever invented, every act of cruelty recorded in their chronicles, every war crime documented in their archives. The Vorlak fleet received this information all at once without warning or preparation. Alien minds that had never experienced such concentrated evil were suddenly exposed to the complete catalog of human darkness. Ships began going silent across the fleet. Crew members collapsed at their stations, overwhelmed by visions of human brutality. Some vessels simply stopped responding to communications, their crews catatonic with psychological trauma. Admiral Vextar watched his fleet die around him, not from weapons, but from knowledge. The humans hadn't destroyed his ships. They had destroyed his people's ability to function after learning what humanity was truly capable of. Sir, whispered his aide, request permission to surrender unconditionally. Vextar nodded slowly. There was no point in continuing. The humans had won not by being stronger, but by being willing to become monsters when monsters were needed. Fleet Admiral Korthvin made one final desperate attempt to destroy Earth. His purist faction launched every weapon they had at the human homeworld, hoping to eliminate the source of the psychological contamination. But the attack was uncoordinated and desperate. Human defenses, now integrated with captured Vorlak technology, were more than adequate to handle it. More importantly, many of Korthvin's own ships refused to fire on civilian targets. They had been too influenced by human concepts of individual moral choice. The attack failed. Korthvin's fleet surrendered or fled. The war was over. Commander Kang Dae-ho stood in what had once been Admiral Vextar's command center, now serving as a temporary headquarters for the human occupation force. Around him, Vorlak officers worked alongside human personnel, processing the surrender of their own fleet. "Status report," he requested. 80% of the Vorlak fleet has surrendered, reported his aide. 15% has fled toward the Galactic Rim, 5% was destroyed in the final engagement, and the crew members, requesting integration into human space. They can't return to Vorlak society. They've been too changed by exposure to our psychology. Kang felt no satisfaction in the victory. Humanity had won by corrupting an entire species. They had proven that their capacity for darkness was more powerful than alien technology or moral superiority. 5 years later, Admiral Lee Jun-ho commanded the Terran Psychological Warfare Division from a base orbiting Mars. His organization had become humanity's primary tool for dealing with alien contact. Not through diplomacy or trade, but through careful psychological manipulation. "Sir," reported his intelligence officer, "we've detected another alien fleet approaching the Centauri system. Initial communications suggest they have hostile intentions." Lee reviewed the files on the new species. They called themselves the Nexari. Their technology was more advanced than the Vorlak had been. Their society was built around concepts of honor and military glory. "Prepare the cultural contamination protocols," Lee ordered. "Start with their concepts of honor. Show them how humans have perverted similar ideas throughout history." The process was routine now. Humanity had become expert at psychological warfare. They identified alien weaknesses, crafted mimetic weapons, and corrupted enemy societies from within. They won wars by making their enemies become like them. "Sir," his aide asked quietly, "don't you ever wonder what we've become?" Lee looked out at the stars, thinking about the Vorlak refugees living in human space. They had been educated so thoroughly that they could never return to their own people. They had become human in all but biology. "We became what we needed to become to survive," he replied. "We became the nightmare that keeps other nightmares away." In the depths of space, the Nexari fleet continued toward human territory. They had studied the fate of the Vorlak Dominion, but they believed their own moral certainty was stronger. They thought they could resist human psychological warfare. They were wrong. The galaxy whispered about the nightmare species now, the beings who fought not with superior technology but with weaponized darkness. Species that encountered humanity had 3 choices: submit, flee, or be corrupted into becoming like them. Most chose corruption. It was easier than admitting that monsters sometimes wore the faces of those they claimed to protect. On Earth, children learned fairy tales about brave knights and noble heroes. They didn't know that their planet had become the source of a psychological plague that was slowly transforming the galaxy. They didn't know that humanity's greatest weapon was its willingness to abandon humanity when survival required it. Director Choi Min-woo, now retired, sometimes wondered if they had saved their species or damned it. Project Nightmare had been successful beyond all imagination. But success had come at the cost of everything they claimed to be protecting. In the end, perhaps that was the most human thing of all. They had won by becoming monsters, then convinced themselves they had done it for noble reasons. The stars continued to shine, indifferent to the darkness that now spread between them. And humanity continued to spread as well, carrying with them the gift of corruption disguised as civilization. The war was over. The education would never end.